Welcome to Recovery Rising with Kelly and Reva, a podcast dedicated to exploring the journey of eating disorder recovery through real stories, advocacy, and awareness.
I'm Kelly Doss.
And I'm Reva Van Vliet.
And Reva and I do this podcast based on our own experiences with having an eating disorder and what our recovery journey has looked like. So we are not mental health professionals. So if you are struggling with an eating disorder or someone you love is struggling with an eating disorder, please seek out a licensed mental health professional who specializes in eating disorders.
Yeah.
So last week we talked about diet culture, and that's going to be a nice segue into this week. How can we combat diet culture?
Yeah.
And one of the ways we can do that is through self-advocacy and setting boundaries.
Yes.
So, and the thing with eating disorder recovery is those boundaries will kind of shift as you go through what those boundaries look like as you go through the journeys. So,
yeah. Well, yeah. And last week we talked about sometimes like distancing yourself from that like diet culture, and that can look like distancing yourself from certain groups or people in your life, or even not distancing, but setting expectations how you want that relationship to look can be a boundary. So for my kind of boundary setting and recovery, it feels uncomfortable because like I was trained, probably just like you grew up a little bit, that saying no and like setting those boundaries or even like taking time for yourself is like perceived as selfish, or I was grown up to be a people pleaser, just make sure everyone else is happy, if that means just like keeping quiet or even like doing things that don't feel like aligned with my values. That is kind of like how I navigated life until I reached a better like healed space in my recovery and in general. But even setting those boundaries can feel uncomfortable, even if you are actively setting them.
Right. Yeah, boundaries was not really a word I heard growing up.
Yeah.
Creating those spaces for yourself. And of course, like you said, setting those boundaries and advocating for yourself. It's just really creates that supportive environment for a long-term recovery. So that word will be very important on your eating disorder recovery journey, as it was for us.
Yeah.
And I agree with you too. Just growing up, trying to be the good little girl, trying to be perfect all the time, being the people pleaser was a huge part of me growing up. I was just taught never to cause a stir, don't rock
Keep
the boat.
Yes.
And that was actually a pretty big life lesson I had to learn was, I do have to pick my battles, don't get me wrong, but learning that honesty was more important than keeping the peace all the time. So that was an example of me setting a boundary. And it's still something I continue to work on.
Yeah.
I know when I go to energy healings, I haven't done a ton of them in my life, but I found it odd that every time I go, they say your throat chakra is blocked. And I'm like, and that one has to do with, communication and that type of stuff. So I'm like, yeah, I guess.
Yeah, because it's something you're like always having to check in with yourself, because of course like life shifts and boundaries like shift and change. And I always like, whenever I pictured a boundary, or when like we first kind of started talking about this idea of boundaries, I always pictured like a wall. Like I just needed to put a wall up, but between me and that other person or that thing. But now I just like kind of see them as like shifting sort of like, I don't know, things, structures that like change over time. And boundaries, like I said, like can look like distancing yourself, but they can also just like be like communicating with people, like communicating your needs, especially when we're talking about self-advocacy. I think that's why we're talking about these two together, because like that is a big part of advocating for yourself, like speaking up for yourself, setting limits, setting those expectations again.
Yeah, I know for me too, early on in the recovery, it was actually knowing what to expect. And sometimes that did include distancing myself from certain situations that I just wasn't ready for yet. But you're right, it does shift over time. And I've found that, speaking up for myself is that form of advocacy that I do need, especially like we were talking about last week about with diet culture and, all the messaging that we're hearing, and learning to pick my battles and be honest and speak up for myself. That's a part for me, boundaries. And I know too, probably what helped me best in self-advocacy and setting boundaries was actually role playing with my therapist, because I didn't have any experience speaking for myself. I didn't know what that looked like, and I knew it would be super uncomfortable.
Yes.
So what we worked on first was, suppressing, I don't want to say suppressing, that's not the right word, but regulating the anxiety.
Yes.
Because thinking about standing up for myself, maybe upsetting people, caused a lot of anxiety. So I had to learn the nervous system regulation, taking deep breaths, but also, role playing and, just so I could have that experience of, in these scenarios, like this is what I could say in a very effective way, not just shouting at people or whatever that looked like. So just having that role play scenario with my therapist in a safe space. Of course, I knew I had to set that expectation. It might not exactly look that way when that scenario came up.
That's so awesome you had that practice.
Yeah.
Because it can feel like you're just like a fish out of water when you're trying some of these. Like with anything, like and we've talked about this in other episodes, like recovering from an eating disorder, like you feel like brand new, sort of. Like you're just kind of like learning how to do things over again, sort of. Yeah. That's so important to like do that practicing. That's so cool. That and like speaking of therapy, like in therapy for me, it was also identifying like my values, because you can feel, for me at least, I felt really lost, like who I was, like what values were really important to me, because a lot of my values were kind of like embedded in my eating disorder, like behaviors, or what I thought I should value or what I should be or represent. So identifying like what I value and what's important to me, and the type of person like I want to be, the type of people I want to surround myself with, that then kind of carried over to actively being able to set those boundaries based on what was important and like protective for me.
I think that's a very important step too, is what aligns with your values. What are your values?
Exactly.
And, what the different situations you put yourself in, does it align with it, the things that people talk about and all those things. And I think for me too, learning to allow what I let in too, because I can't control everything and I can't distance myself from everything. So just allowing what I let in, it kind of goes back to, picking my battles. Sometimes it can be like, well, this is what this person thinks, if it's one of those scenarios, and then I just let it go. That might be a situation where I do speak up for myself, but really having to regulate what I let in and what I let get to me too.
That's such a good point, because I mean, that is like something we all, need to learn, like what things to just kind of, like let in, or just because one person thinks or says or does something, it doesn't need to completely like, I felt like well, especially when you're going against the grain in this like weird like diet culture society, but even like with like family relationships, or even outside of that diet culture piece, like it can feel like if one bad scenario or someone says something, or they don't like you, or they don't agree with you, it would like knock me off, and I'd be like, well, see, like I am a bad person. But now it's like, hey, we have differing viewpoints, and that's again part of that importance of like just really doing that deep work into yourself and your values, and like protecting your peace too is so huge.
And I think when it comes to advocacy, this is something that probably you and I both have experienced. I think we've even talked about it in previous episodes, is when it comes to your own treatment, especially in medical scenarios. I know there have been instances where I went to the ER and I just got yelled at. So just advocating like, this is not what I need. If you hear something, you're like, well, I just don't think that's going to be the right path, speaking up for yourself, especially when it comes to insurance companies. That'll be another episode for that advocacy, or advocating for, getting the treatment you need through the insurance companies. But yeah, even when you come across, maybe it's a doctor you come across as you're going in for a physical or something like that, just advocating for yourself.
Yes. And that can feel so daunting. And I think like when I was so sick, like, and trying to advocate for myself, it was like, I couldn't do that. I wasn't in a position to do that because I was at war with myself. And so then, being in the care of, medical professionals that maybe didn't know, well, they didn't know eating disorders. And that is so scary. And I know we've talked about this, and I'll put that aside for today, but I think also just like continuing that conversation. Like I've had those conversations now, being in a place of recovery with people like in my community and my family, my husband, and my husband's become a really great advocate for me. So when I wasn't able to advocate for myself, he was there. And also other like trained mental health professionals in the eating disorder realm were and are there. And I think that's like, yeah, I know it's kind of going on a tangent, but I think we can't talk about advocacy without talking about that piece, how important it is to lean into those resources and professionals that are like doing this work. Yeah. And even like you said, going into doctor appointments, I mean, now being in recovery, how I self-advocate, I do research, like you would if just anybody would, like make sure they align with their doctor, their primary care doctor. But I do research, like, what is this person's values? What is their background in? I tell them my story, although it's listed on my chart. I mean, it's important to vocalize that, and like even setting like boundaries around like weigh-ins. You don't have to get weighed if you don't want to. Like or you can request blind weights. Just certain things like that, and even
Absolutely.
and also making sure your like team is, say, hey, it's important for me to make sure you're communicating with my therapist or my dietitian, which that can feel like so daunting when you're in it. I do want to say that, because it's like easy for me to say is like, make sure they know this, but when you're sick and not your best friend, like that self-advocacy piece can be really hard.
Absolutely. I like that you brought up too, other people in your life can be those advocates when you can't always be or not ready to be yet. So that can be parents, friends, spouses. Absolutely. And I like to, I was thinking about this as you were talking too. Like one of the first ways I got to advocate for myself was the weigh-ins, because I would turn backwards. And I was like, well, it's in my chart. The nurse should know not to say out loud what the weight is. And it kept happening a couple of times. And finally I just said, the reason I do this is because I'm in recovery from anorexia. So to this day, I still do the blind weigh-ins.
Exactly.
I tell them why, just to.
And your point earlier, like, they're not always gonna be like, okay, yeah, sure. And they might continue to do it. And that is a problem. It's not like, oh, it's okay. But just know that you're not the problem. Like, I have to remind myself that too. Like, it is good and it is healthy and it is important that I am requesting these things from me, and I deserve that. Everyone deserves that. And just because there's like a mismatch there from your provider or nurse, doesn't mean that you're doing the wrong thing, because it can feel uncomfortable, but it is so important. And I was even just thinking, like, I was new into my recovery this last time, being pregnant with Maple, my youngest, and going through the like glucose test. And I remember I just was so nervous and distraught, and that was a really hard time for me. But I had a really great provider that I called her office, and I just said, hey, like, I can't go like through with this testing. I don't have a history of diabetes. And I just like, so she talked to me, she heard me out, and she made sure everyone else was on the same page. And it was just like so healing, and it was so uncomfortable. I was still really sad. I was still like upset and scared and felt like it was a wrong thing or whatever. But in the end, like, oh man, I feel like I my recovery benefited from that. And that's really what matters is
absolutely.
Do these boundaries, does like the way that I'm talking with people and communicating with people, does this support my recovery?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line.
Yeah.
And what I like too about going through self-advocacy or learning to be your own best advocate is that it spills into other lives where you can advocate for yourself. So it's just a great tool for other areas of your life too. So yes, I like what you said. It's all about your mental health, your well-being. That's what's most important. That's why you're doing self-advocacy.
Yes, we all deserve that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great.
Well, thanks for joining us this week, and we'll see you next time. With honesty and compassion, Recovery Rising is here to remind you that recovery is not only possible, but worth celebrating.
And so each week we like to take a little bit of our time to reflect on a moment that we celebrated recovery this last week. I would say just, the way that I've been celebrating this week has really just been looking inward, and like, especially, we kind of talked about this last week too, but with just like, we're in that season right now where diet culture and resolutions and is just like in our face. And so I've just been taking time to look inward and make sure that I'm kind of living out my like values and just being like kind to myself, just like making sure I'm okay.
And I think for me too, the self-talk, I think just being more cognizant of when my nervous system is getting a little hyped up. So that self-talk, okay, I'm safe now, there's no reason. And it's just these little cues I get from my body where I'm starting to pay more attention to it so I can catch it early on. So just really being intentional about my self-talk and regulating the nervous system has been a gift for me. So
so awesome.
Yeah, so if you want to share in the comments or send us a message of what your celebration of recovery moment looked like this week, we'd really appreciate it.
Thank you. See you next week.